Cheers and salutations. It's time for you to boot up and suit up. Time for the fight of all fights. Star Wars versus Warhammer 40K, Episode 9, Dark Horizons. Welcome one and all. This is going to be a fun video. As you all know, this is Chicago Reacts. I'm Kit, so please be sure to like, comment, share, and subscribe, and hit that ring bell notification. That way, all of you are made aware we upload new content upon our YouTube channel. And today, folks, we talk about the aftermath. Perhaps now minds will come together and talk about what can be done. What can the Republic do against the glorious Imperium of mankind? Because after all, the Republic offends me. But nonetheless, the Imperium will prevail. But it's always good for all of you hip cool cats to support the original content creators. Why? Because it's the right thing to do. I expect all of you to do it. This was done by a fan with too much time. So as a favor for me, please, please, please support his work. He has done phenomenal narrations. And obviously this is the first season of this awesome series. So, hey, support original content creators. Do that. All right, so the original link is in the description box below. And shout out to a fan with too much time. Let's get ready to check this video out in 3, 2, 1. And grab yourself a tasty snack, a tasty beverage too.
One whose path has taken a new turn is often initially disoriented. But as time passes, and the path continues steadily in its new direction, there is a tendency to believe that it will remain so forever. But such a turn does not always mean that the victim has lost, or that the victor has won. All warriors understand the need to face and defeat the enemy. Both aspects of the task can be challenging. Both can require thought, insight, and planning. But a warrior may forget that even the task of identifying the enemy can be difficult, and the cost of that failure can lead to catastrophe. Failures in any of those areas can cost unnecessary time and irreplaceable lives.
Now, Rogue One, I'm going to say was okay. However, where Disney Star Wars is going is, well, I think it's going down the crapper at this point in time. There's why they would give up on the expanded universe is beyond me. It literally could have crapped out money for them and infinitum. But seeing Disney going belly up and the fact that they will not be reaching a $1 billion mark by the end of 2023 is just great news to me. Okay, and I'm really happy to hear that Godzilla -1 is actually dominating in the North American box office. It's number 3 right now, at least last I checked the numbers, but outstanding work. Well done, Godzilla.
She entered, brazen as her station allowed, dressed in what Orion assumed to be her most comfortable naval uniform, and flanked by 4 of her guards, one of whom was the captain of that guard. She had all the bearing and air of a woman going into a war council, which was much as he had expected her to react. It was how the vast majority of Imperial officers of any branch behaved when he invited them to anything that wasn't strictly a war council. So when Admiral Rolla froze at the sight of him, he did not take it as a slight or insult, but as part of the due course. He was standing beside the table they were to share, a simple thing of wood and silver, wide enough to hold a hefty course between them, yet not so large as to wordlessly invite many more than 2 occupants, particularly with only 2 chairs being present. The room itself was an abandoned chapel, large enough to sit a few hundred, which made it pathetically small by comparison to what was standard. It was clearly in disuse, dusty, abandoned, with most of the pews cleared away, leaving a large expanse before the lectern where sat their modest table.
How could you abandon such a glorious imperial shrine?
The room was lit by torches, the lumen strips in the ceilings and walls either broken or subpar after so long without proper maintenance. 2 space marines accompanied Orion, his 2 most trusted honor guard, and while they were fully armed and armored, Orion, most notably, was not. He stood in a deep blue habit, tied about his waist with a golden tassel. On his chest stretched the imperial aquila, and his robe was lined with gilded thread. But outside of these details, his robe was plain, finely made, but certainly modest.
What game are you playing at? Interesting. Normally we see the Astartes all suited up. Ah. He's trying to assess the political situation, because while the Imperium of Mankind on paper looks like a united force around the God Emperor of Mankind, it can be argued it's somewhat of a confederation with various factions and institutions, like the Imperial Guard, the Imperial Navy, the numerous Space Marine chapters. There's Adeptus Custodes, there is the Adeptus Mechanicus, there's the Imperial Inquisition, there are rogue traders, and so much more. And yes, you got to include the High Lords of Terra, everything, all of that and above. Check, 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 check. Plus all the various factions within said groups and institutions that I mentioned. So yes, the Imperium isn't as unified as one would think.
She looked at him as though she had found him standing naked, and it was not lost on Orion that this was likely the first time she had ever seen a Space Marine unarmored, and likely it would be the only time she ever saw someone of his rank in such a state. But Orion prided himself on his tactical deployment of humility, a weapon all too accessible, yet too often neglected by the men of his order. In response to her expression, he gave the barest hint of a smile and pulled her chair out, gesturing towards it. Rolla nodded to her guards, and Orion knew from the slight pause which followed.
So a fan was too much time? You know, I don't know if you have a shop or anything like that, but if there's any way somebody could get like a copy of this image, this picture, because I know A Fan Was Too Much Time has actually commented on some of our videos. 10 out of 10, you're doing some great narration here, already building up the atmosphere. But I'm wondering, since you have said that you have commissioned artists to do this work for you, I'm wondering if there's a copy. One would wonder if one could get a copy.
Followed that she had given them orders. They departed, moving to the 4 corners of the room to create a perimeter, while Orion's honor guard backed away enough to not be intrusive, but remained at either side of their chapter master. As she came forward to take a seat, he crossed over to his own seat, a much larger chair made to accommodate his size. Once she sat, Lord Admiral Rolla looked across at Orion. Her face was a mask of cordial neutrality, something he knew she could fake readily, thanks to her augmentations, which also provided her with the beauty of a much younger creature. "Ah, Lord Admiral Rolla, I'm glad that you could meet me here for this small dinner. It is not often that I am afforded the privilege of dining with the Lord Admiral of the sector herself," he said. She raised an eyebrow in response. "I see. I'm sure it will not surprise you to know that I have never had the privilege of dining alongside Astartes, much less one of such a profound rank and seniority. I do not expect that such an event comes lightly or without cause." Orion nodded. "Indeed, there is a great cause to our meeting here," Orion admitted. "But I am sincere when I say it is a privilege. I worked closely with your predecessor for a time, before the Battle of Uxinil's Heart. He and I would often meet like this during the Retaliation Wars." This was a lie. Orion had worked closely with the previous Lord Admiral, and they had dined in this very place. Twice. But only once on purpose, and only once like they were doing now. Still, he could see it taking the truth just that much farther, could see the very slight, nearly imperceptible changes in her movements as she lifted the menu resting before her. "I can imagine how that might be the case. Lord Admiral Bosun was reputed to have been an incredible man," she said as her eyes drifted across the lettering. "And I have every reason, after reading about your account on Kentalis, to believe that you will be just as capable," Orion said, lifting his own menu as well. Her eyes trembled. She didn't read the last word, he knew. She had skipped it as the impact of his words took her. Yes, he knew about Kentalis. Long before she had even been a proper admiral, an early showing of her promise as a commanding officer in the Navy, yet something that would go unmentioned throughout most of her accolades. It was something that could only be found after it was sought, and no casual seeking would have uncovered it.
Wow.
"I see you know much of me," she said casually. She placed her menu down gently, folding her hands together and looking at Orion as he mirrored the movement. "And I know much of you as well, Orion Phaedrus. Your record is formidable, even compared to others among your ascended kind. Simply that you are the most senior of all the commanders from between 3 chapters of Astartes speaks volumes without utterance. But the work you did on Jubilation of Tau, Gargantua 9, and Yevon Secundus, masterful." He nodded, not denying her. Of course, he knew what she was implying. All 3 of those worlds had faced insurrections, and all 3 had to be restructured extensively. He himself had been forced to intervene in each of these conflicts, not simply to root out the traitors and insurrectionists, but to repair the severely corrupted and decayed power structures that had been uncovered there. "I am
Precisely.
glad that you appreciate the care my chapter takes in ensuring the loyalty and stability of the Emperor's dominion. I expect you would do no less in my position." She smiled at that, though it was not a kind smile. "Of course, we must all do what we can as our duties demand. And yet, forgive me for saying so, but many may consider such duties to fall under the purview of the Inquisition. Others who are less dedicated or daring may even consider it an overreach of your authority." Orion felt his eye desire to twitch, but smothered the impulse. Discipline was his greatest weapon, and he was never unarmed. Still, he had to commend the Lord Admiral. She had a way of cutting to the point with a touchless blade. "Lord Admiral, do you know much of the Cascani insurrection of Yevon Secundus?" he asked. A servitor entered the room then, clicking and clacking on metal limbs, like a 4-legged insect.
Ugh.
It came to each of them in turn, taking their orders and writing them.
Hey, what's a greater hell? Being a servitor and unable to ever be free, or just like you're just a servitor, or being a servitor but you are stuck with some memories of your past life, and that that you are entombed forever in the body of a servitor. What is a greater hell? The ignorance of bliss, or is that a blissful ignorance? There you go. Or actually being self-aware. Type in the comment section below.
Them down precisely before scuttling away again. When this was done, Rolla turned to answer the chapter master's question. "I was referring to the Prokin rebellion, actually," she said. "Yes, I suspected you were. But do you know of this prior event?" he pressed. I'm afraid not, she said. Orion leaned back in his chair. I was a battle brother then, a tactical marine. My whole squad of 10 had been sent to Yevon Secundus to put down a heretical insurrection. Rebels, worshipping some kind of fertility god, had started capturing and sacrificing members of the nobility, as well as sabotaging off-world grain shipments. He sighed heavily, and though he desired the impression it gave off, this was no feint. The memory weighed heavily on him. It had truth and the power of truth in it. So we found them. We killed most of them, took their leaders prisoner. It was easy. A near-complete waste of our time, he said. Why capture their leaders? The Lord Admiral asked. Orion smiled a sad smile. It was the real reason we were there. My chapter didn't care if this planet lost a few grain shipments, or if a few haughty nobles were eaten alive on a planet-wide vidcast. The reason my chapter responded was because these heretics, they were killing in the name of a god, a foul, unknown god, and we needed to root it out. He could see in her posture, though not in her face, that she didn't quite understand. You see, Lord Admiral, rarely, I mean truly rarely, is it the case that an insurrection purports to worship a god of any kind, and is in truth worshipping nothing. Normally, it is some kind of Xeno, or charismatic rogue psyker, or worse. It was this thing that we were hunting, and so we took their leaders prisoner in order to interrogate them, to force them to reveal the location of their gods. Orion shook his head.
Yeah, so, like, who would be responsible for that? Well, Eldar or Dark Eldar. Maybe a race allied to the Tau or some unknown alien species. Heaven forbid, one of the Men of Iron. Gene Stealers, I know those guys. Possibly Necrons, possibly. Orcs, no, never, unless it was one really weird boy. Chaos, yes. And or a charismatic psyker. Yeah, so those are the usual suspects who would try and make themselves look greater.
They did. On the first night, in the first hour, they told us. We did not believe them, and I personally aided the chaplains in forcing them through every single measure and method of truth extraction that they could survive. And yet, when they lay broken and chittering at the end, the answer was the same, and it was a terrible answer.
Oh.
She leaned in, and he continued. There was no God.
What?
They made it up, he said simply. The Lord Admiral blinked. Well,
What?
that hardly seems so terrible, she said. Does it? He asked, his voice heavy and serious. Think about it, Lord Admiral. Orion continued. Normally, it takes some kind of alien parasite, or psychic tyrant, or spiritual corruption to taint mankind against the Emperor, to make them renounce his laws, and his will, and their own faith in him, to side with something else. It normally requires a display of power, or a promise of true reward. But when we finished our interrogations, we were left with a mundane but horrendous reality. These men had been hungry and angry. They had watched their children die. They watched their wives waste away and their brothers and sisters pass into the grave pointlessly. The men and women of the Imperium are always willing to sacrifice for the Emperor, but it must be for him, for something. But the High King of Yevon Secundus starved and ruined his people, day by day, year by year, out of sheer negligence and incompetence. So great was the menace of his own administration that he was the source of this profane god. He compelled it into existence, for it was only through the use of this made-up entity that the rebels could fight him. And they fought him rightly. The words were like balls of hard ice being thrown directly into the Admiral's face. How can you say that? Serving the planetary governor is serving the... Yevon Secundus produced nothing, Orion interjected. What it shipped out was always dwarfed by the expense of what it shipped in. The world had once been an agri-world until the High King and his line, drunk on delusions of grandeur, attempted to convert the planet into a hive.
No.
He had no plan. Barely enough resources to attempt the lunacy of his design, and no consideration for his existing infrastructure. He destroyed his planet, destroyed his people, and was content to let his whole world choke. 3 half-built hives and a ruined system of grain farms, all he had to show for it, and everything he was willing to settle for. And because of that, the people of his expiring world served nothing but the indulgence of their High King's utter lack of fitness. Rolus and Durin nodded, her movement sympathetic and genuine. So you left the first time, she concluded. Orion laughed. We shot him, he said. We shot him, and his son, and his 2 daughters. Painless deaths.
Oh.
Better than he deserved. So, what exactly is the point of this story? Rolla asked. Orion leaned in this time. The High Queen remarried. Her new husband became the new High King, and his son their successor. When me and my chapter were forced to return during the Procan Rebellion, everything was somehow worse. This time, the fight was not easy. This time, an entire company, 100 of us, not 10, were needed to bring the world back into order. And this time, 3 of my brothers, 3, died on that planet. True anger began to resonate into his voice now, and he didn't attempt to restrain it. Brother Tascairn Chold, Brother Sasran Olden, and Apothecary Julian Vrain. 480 years of combat experience between them, and they died killing desperate, starving humans who had been driven so far out of their senses by their conditions that they dared to rebel. The old Space Marine shook his head. It was there and then where I realized that it was not enough to merely excise the infection. The wound needed to be bandaged, rested, and healed. So this time we shot them all, the High King, the High Queen, and their entire family lines. I created trials, tests, and took those who succeeded and mentored them briefly in the ways of rulership, in the ways of administration.
Correct.
We taught them to stand, and then
Correct.
we let them stand. I am no tetrarch. I do not aspire to be one.
Right.
The reason Yevon Secundus still has a High King is because I still insisted on respecting the structure that was already there, that which could be salvaged. As I was then, I am now. He paused briefly as the half-mechanical servant placed a dish of spiced void eels before the Lord Admiral, all artfully displayed, each wide-mouthed.
To my fellow Warhammer 40k fans, what kind of delicious food is out there in the realm of 40k? No, I'm not talking about the rations. No, I'm not talking about that. But like delicious types of food out there. Type in the comment section below. What is out there? Because those void seals look very delicious. Look very appetizing and appealing.
Filled with a candied Centurion apricot. He resumed after his own dish. A steaming bowl of something blue and very hot was set down. It smelled like wet plaster and somehow left a metallic sting in the Admiral's nostrils. So then, I can assume that, since you are now as you were then, you are eyeing the power structure of our isolated forces. Is that right?
Yeah,
She
you
asked,
should.
picking up her utensils and cutting into the supple flesh of the first eel. Perhaps I would be, if one existed, Orion said.
That's right.
But if we are no longer abiding by the rules of commander seniority, then there is none. There is no Imperium here. What there is an aging battle fleet, 3 Space Marine chapters, many extremely varied regiments of the Imperial Guard, several overloaded black ships full of volatile psychers, and thousands of transports housing almost 15 planets worth of civilians who will all soon be arriving at this system. There is no Departmentum Unitorum, there is no Segmentum Command, there is no Terra, no Astronomicon, no High Lords.
Oh, no.
There is just us, and soon there will not even be that. The Lord Admiral wanted to protest, wanted to refute his statements, but she couldn't. Not while he was looking at her, not when she had no way of refuting his words without resorting to delusion. He could see it in her artificial eyes, still too human to hide her soul underneath. Then, what do you want from me? Command of the fleet? Command of the transports? She asked sarcastically. He didn't take her bait, didn't flinch as he proceeded. Work with me, Lord Admiral. Stand with me, not under me, but alongside me. Put your trust and your weight behind my chapter in the negotiations to come. The Imperium is not here until we make it here. Help me do that. The Lord Admiral stared in.
That's what you got to do, because you got to contend with so many people there. If that is how big the fleet is, 15 planets worth of ships. That means you got the Mechanicus, you got Knights, you've got Titans, possibly. Oh, you've got so much politics to deal with. Oh no, and there's no Imperium to reinforce you. Oh no, I almost forgot the Sisters of Battle. I'm probably gonna get shot later for that. But yeah, the Sisters of Battle. This is not good.
Into his burning golden eyes for several long moments, judging him, his words, his worth, and his loyalty. And that was as it should be. After all, he had done the same before ever meeting her. Ultimately, her response was a heavy sigh as she placed her fork down, a juicy chunk of pitch-black eel flesh still attached to the end.
Looks delicious.
I will agree to hear you out, she said. Orion smiled, but suppressed most of it, restraining his expression to a subtle grin as he nodded, lifting his own spoon and dipping it into the bubbling concoction before him. He had her, even if she didn't want to realize it then. Already she agreed with him, and now the rest was merely a matter of social formality. Thank you. That is all that I can ask.
So, what are your thoughts? I think he's correct in making that decision of trying to build some kind of infrastructure and leadership, because if the Imperium is to stand against not only the Republic but also the Confederacy, the Imperium has to stand as one, or they will fall.
The room was simple, circular, its tiled walls and glossy stone floors a perfect model of Rothanian minimalist architecture and design. The only pieces of furniture present within the room were a large white pentagonal hollow table at its center and the plethora of comfortable rotating chairs placed around it. Despite them all being in attendance, most of the chairs were empty. There were not many that Anakin, Obi-Wan, and Mace had judged worthy of being considered as competent advisors. First among those few they had recognized was Anakin himself. He sat beside Captain Rex and Echo, the latter of whom had recently been promoted to full commando and was thereby representing Clone Force 99 at this meeting. Directly across from Anakin and the clones was Dr. Sheena, who sat in a levitating mobile chair, her legs still locked within a cast, though she seemed to be otherwise recovering swiftly. Sitting to her right was a straight-backed Captain Spikes, who wore the uniform of a naval officer, having even gone so far as to remove his helmet from the ensemble. To Dr. Sheena's left sat Bucket, who wore his white trooper armor and helm, and slouched like he was facing a court-martial. Additionally, sitting to Bucket's left was a newcomer. Admiral Wilhelm Tarkin, who had arrived only hours before, looked down his nose at the rest of the room with his one good eye. The man wore a sling, a still bloody bandage obscuring his left eye, and white medical burn patches dotted his chin and neck. He was now a veteran of the retreat at Axum, which was quickly coming to be known by the galactic community as the Blue Massacre. Presiding over them, as assessors, were Jedi Masters Mace Windu and Obi-Wan Kenobi. It was their duty to determine what effect this emergency meeting of theirs would have. We know that all of you have a lot of experience to bring to this conversation, and a lot of ideas as to what direction would be most productive, so we'll begin there, said Obi-Wan. Each of you will be given some time to state what you think is the most important issue to address, and why. Rest assured, we will address all of these issues, but it will be up to me, Master Obi-Wan, and the Supreme Chancellor to determine in what order these problems are to be addressed. Keeping that in mind, I think we will start with young Skywalker and move around the table clockwise. Mace added. Objections? He asked. None were raised. Good. Then Skywalker, please begin. Anakin stood up from his chair. His face was fierce, but controlled. We lost 27 Jedi, including Master Ki-Adi-Mundi, in the retreat from Axum. Nearly all of them were killed in personal combat with these, Astartes, General. Thank you, Echo. Astartes. And I know why. I realized it while fighting the one I encountered over Anaxis. They're fast and strong, much faster and stronger physically than any droid or even Sith that we have been made to face. So naturally, when I began fighting him, I treated him as I would a Sith or Jedi combatant. The moment I did that, I began to lose badly. Because they aren't Force sensitives, Obi-Wan said, the revelation mixing awe into his voice as he spoke. Wait, Mace interjected. Do you mean to tell me these Astartes are managing these feats entirely without the aid of the Force?
Excuse me. But they are being guided by the hand of the Emperor himself. So how dare you, sir? How simply dare you? Shame on you.
Hard to believe, I know, but we need to start believing it. Start training the remaining Jedi against it. These new warriors are not using precognition to guide their strikes, and trying to preempt them that way will only allow them to catch you by surprise again and again until you recognize what you are facing. We need to fight them the way that we fight Magna Guards and Commando Droids, but with a few alterations. There are certain forms that we cannot use against these enemies. Their swords are heavy, and they have more than enough power to move and leverage them with ease. Parries and blocks using Makashi won't compensate well. It could mean instant death. Additionally, the Gemso won't work either. They're faster and stronger than us. We cannot overcome their physical strength and speed consistently, and without that, aggressive forms cannot hold. I think Anakin was cut short as Mace raised his hand. You have made your point, Skywalker, but your time is up. What is your suggestion? Anakin barely restrained a glare, but sighed and continued. What I'm suggesting is that we need to retrain the Jedi Order as a whole to deal with these new enemies. If we don't, then we're just going to continue losing knights. With that, Anakin sat down, and the turn passed over to Captain Rex. The clone stood, dressed in his customized blue-tinted armor, his helmet placed on the table before him. Permission to speak freely, generals? He asked. Granted, said both Obi-Wan and Anakin. He coughed to clear his throat. I do not mean to dismiss the weapons given to us by the Republic. They have worked well against the clankers and the militia that the Separatists have been throwing at us. So what I'm going to say may seem hard to believe, but it needs to be said, and I believe it needs to be acted on right away. Rex pulled his left blaster pistol out of its holster and slid it onto the table. We need better guns. To further punctuate his point, the clone pressed a button on the side of his helmet, sending its data to the holotable, which promptly displayed said data as a three-dimensional blue image. It was the Space Marine they had been fighting, viewed from Rex's perspective. The assembled experts, clones, and Jedi watched as Rex, Tech, Hunter, and then Wrecker, after he had finished reloading, unloaded a torrent of lethal blue bolts into the large yet defiantly nimble form of the Astartes. More than half of the bolts were deflected, and yet several got past the warrior's guard. The blue bolts splashed and hissed against his armor, landing in volleys that would have downed super battle droids. But against the Space Marine, they seemed to do only superficial damage.
It wasn't going to do anything. Even an Imperial Guard lasgun can do more damage. That's not saying much.
Then the image changed, displaying an altered HUD as they watched from Crosshair's point of view, the scene a twisting, confusing mess before it halted abruptly with a view of the Astartes' bloody face, which lasted all of a millisecond before Crosshair blew it away. The Marine's eyes popped like grapes. Burning skin flayed off his skull by the high-energy particles of the shot, revealing the resilient bones underneath. The image then fast-forwarded to the moment when the Astartes, little more than a smoldering skull atop armor at this point, sat up. The image froze. I don't know how or why, but energy blasts and ion bolts are not cutting it. Our EMP grenades would likely do very little damage to them as well. These are clearly not droids. We need weapons that can kill these things with a headshot, or better yet, weapons that can penetrate that armor. He pressed the same button on his helmet and disconnected the feed, turning the image off. We needed them at Pazab. We needed them at Anaxis, and we're going to need them worse and worse the longer we don't have them. So my suggestion is simple. We get them, invent them, buy them. It doesn't matter, but we get them ASAP and get them in the hands of the troops fast. That should be our most immediate concern. Thank you, Rex, said Obi-Wan, giving him a nod as the clone sat back down. Next was Captain Spikes. He stood up, formal, straight, holding a datapad in his right hand. He pressed something on its surface and a holovid began to play on the table. It was a view of the Freedom, mere seconds before it had been destroyed. It began firing at something out of sight, tilting to angle more turbo lasers at it, but that didn't last long. Like a god's cruel knife, a large outsider ship drove into view, its blade-like prow absorbing the brief spurts of concentrated fire the Freedom had managed to throw at it before plunging into the Venator-class Star Destroyer. The arrowhead form of the Republic cruiser was split down the center, both sides buckling upward around the wedge-like head of the enemy ship. Fire and debris spilled from the struck craft like clouds of stellar gore, stirred and split suddenly when the colossal broadside guns of the enemy ship fired, the hollow-view panning back somewhat to show the shots ripping two more Venators into pieces. Then the vid ended, and instead a tactical display was put up in its place. It revealed the battle in time-lapse. The enemy ships were represented as red dots of various sizes, and friendly vessels were similar but blue and smaller. As the sterile information displayed a virtual mirror of the carnage they had just seen prior, Captain Spikes began to speak. Our turbo lasers cannot reach the enemy. They lose too much power and travel too slowly over the vacuum to engage at the ranges they are using. Despite that, it appears their ships enjoy engaging in ramming maneuvers. Once in effective range, our weapons do work, but not as well as their armaments. In a straight shootout, they can outlast us. And then there's the issue of size. He tapped his datapad again, displaying one of their ships, a 5-kilometer-long dreadnought. It had gotten itself surrounded by Venators and Class C frigates. They had mauled through its shields, but clearly that wasn't enough.
Nope.
They poured fire into it, but it wasn't dying. The enemy ships can get so large that it becomes hard for captains like me to imagine where to even concentrate fire with a weapon like a turbo laser. Proton torpedoes, concussion missiles, basically anything that explodes, these have been shown to be more effective, and still their payloads aren't packing enough for a decisive victory. He turned off the display, setting the datapad down on the desk. In short, the fleet needs to be rearmed, refitted, and redeployed. How and with what, I cannot pretend to know.
Now, from what I've been reading in the comments section, this takes place just before Revenge of the Sith. So that means Palpatine's plan of eventually overthrowing the Republic and killing the Jedi is kind of getting screwed over here because an unknown force is now instigating into the conflict. So, and if I'm wrong about that, please correct me. But that's the overall kind of consensus that I've gotten, that this takes place just before Anakin's fall. So the attack on Coruscant hasn't taken place yet. So, all right, there's going to be a big old time shift happening.
As it is now, we will bleed tens of ships for each one of theirs that we can take down, and I might be being generous. This needs to be changed before anything else can get done. The Jedi won't have to fight the Astartes, and neither will the clones, if we can just fight off the relatively few ships they do have. We need—
Thank you, Captain. Your recommendation is received, Mace interjected.
Spikes paused, nodded once, and sat down. Dr. Sheena frowned as all eyes moved on to her. Pass, she said, her voice weary. Come on now, I'm sure you've got some kind of suggestion for us, Obi-Wan prompted. She sighed, straightening in her seat. Get the Senate and the Chancellor, all of them, put them on a Mandate or 2 dreadnought, and make it the new capital of the Republic, the doctor said. Every eye went wide. Just like that, Obi-Wan pressed. She sighed again, more heavily, ample brow creasing. Look, I'm just being realistic. The amount of advantages we have over the enemy are finite, extremely finite, but also extremely, extreme. From all the data I have, every single thing I have been able to examine, it seems that their form of FTL travel does not abide or become impeded by mass shadows. I do not know if this is because they can somehow go through them without colliding with them, or because they can maneuver around them while remaining in hyperspace. The point is, they could go from anywhere to anywhere. Maybe this isn't true. Maybe there are other things which divert and impede them that I simply do not know about yet. But if it is true, she said, trailing off, then we won't be able to keep them out of the core, or off of Coruscant by holding hyperspace lanes.
Oh, then Palpatine's going to be upset. But I wonder what Chaos God he would fall to. Now, I don't think Nurgle would be one. Possibly Zinch. Zinch looks like one. Perhaps Korn, but I see Vader, maybe Anakin, a fallen Anakin going to Korn. Slanesh, a possibility. But knowing Palpatine and his greedy nature, he might go for all 4, or dare I say it, go to the 5th god. What? There is no 5th Chaos God. If you've been watching Chicago Reacts from the beginning, you remember that old school joke.
Anakin concluded. Dr. Sheena snapped her fingers. Exactly. Give the angry one a prize. Any moment now they could be departing from the Axum system straight to Coruscant, and we wouldn't be able to stop them, but we would still be able to beat them there.
What do you mean? Mace asked.
They are slow, Dr. Sheena said. Their FTL technology is much, much slower than even what a cheap commercial hyperdrive can provide. They're unstoppable, but not inescapable. We cannot save Coruscant, but we can save the Republic.
By effectively abandoning our traditional seat of power and going into exile, Mace said, his tone suggesting that he was not a fan of the prospect.
Dr. Sheena shrugged. I've made my suggestion. Windu nodded and all eyes slid from the doctor to her companion, the clone trooper Bucket.
I think I'll pass. I'm not really here because I'm a good he started to say.
Oh, no, you don't. They made me be constructive, so you better say something, or I'll never let you off this assignment. Dr. Sheena snapped.
The clone groaned loudly, putting his helmed head in his hands before standing. Okay, so I'm CT-7226, but my friends call me Bucket, because I once got my head stuck in my helmet for almost 2 months, and he said, trailing off for a moment as all watched on. Well, anyway, story for another time, I guess. I didn't really fight them. None boarded our ship, and I'm a trooper, not a pilot or bridge crew. But I do know this. We were headless for a good while there. Some commanders, like Captain Spikes, took control right away, but a lot of us were sort of left floundering. I don't know if that helps, but I feel like we would have done way more damage if any of us had known what we were doing. Exactly, said Tarkin, standing up and speaking for the first time. Bucket gratefully sat back down as Tarkin continued. We've all seen the reports. We've all seen how first contact with these hostile outsiders was carried out, and that is to say, abysmally. And while I mean no disrespect to those assembled here, I feel compelled to go further. Tarkin turned to face Anakin then. You did perhaps the best in this example. You and your team managed to shut down the droid army, recovering intelligence along the way, and managed to self-extract despite unforeseen complications. But you did not retrieve the enemy's body, nor his weapon for examination. You did not take him captive when he was all but disabled." Anakin frowned, but Tarkin did not entertain his glare, moving now to look at Mace Windu and Obi-Wan. "And you two were in charge of the forces defending Anaxis. You chose to retreat in place of contending the ground. Retreat from Anaxis, the site of the most prestigious war college in the Republic, as well as the site of the Azerite shipyards, which were being used to resupply and construct our reserve fleets. All of this despite the enemy not even physically being there to contest the area." "These outsiders had control of a planet-cracking bomb," Obi-Wan protested. "What would you have done? Remained and risked losing the war for the Republic?" Tarkin shook his head and sighed. "It did not even occur to you, because of where your minds are, or rather, where they aren't. The tactical thing to do would have been to retreat 85% of ground forces to high orbit. The 15% who remained would be tasked with holding the production facilities. The enemy would not have destroyed all of Anaxis and its production resources to defeat that number. They
He don't know. Oh, Tarkin, I think you would like the Imperium, but I think you would be shocked by just what they're willing to do to win the day. And if it means blowing up a planet, baby, oh, you out of your element. Hold on, we're gonna rewind that foolishness. You don't think that they won't do it?
It did not even occur to you, because of where your minds are, or rather, where they aren't. The tactical thing to do would have been to retreat 85% of ground forces to high orbit. The 15% who remained would be tasked with holding the production facilities.
And the Imperium has done that before. There was I think Luton did a video on a planet that rebelled against the Imperium. And they were kind of somewhat sort of winning until it was notified by the Imperial commanders that the Tyranid tendril was heading towards the planet. So the Imperium left some of their forces to do a delay action, and eventually majority of the forces left, including some of the others, and eventually the quote-unquote rebels won until the Tyranids arrived, and then the Imperium exterminated the planet. You don't think the Imperium won't crack a planet? Oh, you out your element, Tarkin.
The enemy would not have destroyed all of Anaxis and its production resources to defeat that number. They would have gone down and engaged our forces on the ground. Once the enemy committed forces, then you could safely and gradually commit more of our forces to hold our territory. The enemy would not detonate their weapon while their own soldiers are present on the planet, and that would buy us time to...
You don't know. Oh, what a fool. Oh, Tarkin. You know, I know you're a scumbag in the main timeline, but I like you're coming up with these assumptions, man. Hey, Tarkin. You're all right, baby. All right? You're doing okay.
Neutralize it without losing the Republic's holdings.
Mm-hmm.
And what if the enemy commander decided that 15% of our forces was enough to warrant the bomb going off? Obi-Wan asked. The haggard admiral shrugged casually. Then we lose 15% of our forces at Anaxis and deny the enemy what we have lost. Still a better outcome than what we have now. And as if to prove my point, I myself have just come from an utter disaster of a defense that your now deceased colleague, Jedi Master Ki-Adi-Mundi, orchestrated. Pazab, Anaxis, and now Axum. We will continue to lose worlds if we do not finally address, once and for all, the wrath in the room, Tarkin asserted. And what wrath is that precisely? Mace Windu.
The Jedi. The Jedi, man. They were never fit to be commanders or generals. Case in point, when I was a kid, when I first saw Attack of the Clones, way back in the day at the movie theater, when all you needed really was $20. Now you need more, but like, you know, $20, like you could get yourself a big jumbo popcorn, get a ticket, and still have some change left over, you know? Back when money used to mean something. Back when money used to mean something. When the Jedi were charging into battle, they weren't doing duck and cover. They were leading their troops a full-on battalion charge. Like, no. The robots got laser guns. What's wrong with you? Duck and dodge and dip, dive and dodge.
Windu asked. That the Jedi Knights and the Jedi Order as a whole are not suited to the task of leading this war. You are not trained for it, you are not ideologically predisposed to it, and despite the experience you have all gained in these past 4 years, you are not mentally prepared for the realities of command. Mace Windu waved his hand dismissively. These sound like concerns you should address to the Supreme Chancellor, he said. As you well know, I have, multiple times. The Supreme Chancellor seems to be quite convinced of your competence, despite the evidence. So, as much as I would prefer this be handled by the Chancellor's better judgment, I am forced to rely on your judgment instead. Obi-Wan leaned in, fingers folding. So just what are you proposing, Admiral?
Boy, that's a scary picture of Tarkin right there.
Tarkin looked around for a moment, imperious, straight as a blade, and just as humorless. I am recommending that the Jedi Order as a whole step down, abdicate command of the Republic's armies voluntarily, and allow true military leaders to take control of this war effort. Return to your temples, or enlist to serve properly, but recognize that you are not fit to confront this new enemy, not as you are now. He paused, retrieving a datapad of his own from the surface of the table. No one spoke, and so he pressed on. It does not need to happen all at once, though it could. Our current military structure allows for that kind of rapid reorganization of officers. Slow or fast, gradual or immediate, I have compiled a list of suitably trained and experienced leaders from within the Republic's member worlds. They are loyal, tactical, and most importantly, ruthlessly pragmatic. I have matched them purposefully to each command posting that is currently held by a Jedi commander. As he spoke, the holotable displayed his list in 2 columns. In the right one, names, birth dates, achievements, and current ranks. In the left, faces to match each profile, showing a myriad of species, organizations, and ages. We already know we're going to need to make sweeping changes to contend with this newest threat. If those changes do not begin at the top, then we have little hope of correcting this course before it leads to our eventual defeat and the collapse of all order in the galaxy.
Tarkin's not wrong, and I really like how our narrator, AFanWithTooMuchTime, is really putting a lot of thought into really how the Republic would react to the Imperium. The Imperium of mankind, I think we've all seen what if the Imperium fought this group or that group, and I know that there's been a lot of channels, a lot of YouTube channels say, hey, why does the Imperium always win? Well, because the Imperium, well, they've been at war for 10,000 plus years, more so. I mean, humanity in the 40K universe, my own personal theory, again, about how humanity got to where it's at. I like to think, it's just my headcanon, and I'm probably wrong on this, but I think humanity during the Golden Age, before we fell, we made it on our own. We didn't have World War III. We didn't have a destructive conflict. We actually made it to the stars, and humanity continued to prosper. Not saying that there weren't any wars, because, humans were really professionals at it. But we were able to do it on our own. But normally in a lot of other science fiction series, take, for example, Star Trek. The only reason why we were able to get to space was because of after World War III, and Zephyr and Kraken was able to do that warp drive. But we had help. Usually in some big science fiction series, humanity has some kind of help from an outside force, but we did it on our own. And then when, of course, the tragedy of humanity in the Imperium, or at least in 40K, we lost our ability to be the spacefaring people. And we were suffering through endless warfare, slavery, destruction by enemies from within and outside. And, we're professional, at least humans in 40K are just designed to be warriors through and through and deal with trauma and absolute destruction. And that's something the people in the Republic, all the species, aren't really prepared for.
Tarkin said. When he finished, he sat back down, not waiting to be acknowledged or dismissed by the Jedi. A silence began then that lasted for many uncomfortable seconds before it was broken by an even more uncomfortable statement. You're all wrong. Echo stood then, and began to speak. With all due respect, none of this is what we should be focusing on now, he asserted. Training the Jedi to fight the Astartes, rearming the troops, rearming the fleets, all of that will take time. Too much time. Even if we had all the weapons ready, the refits waiting to be applied, a perfect new lightsaber form to counteract the way they fight, even then it would all still take weeks or months to deploy it. Echo shook his head sadly. And we just don't have time. Replacing the Jedi won't make that any different, and the last thing we need right now is to scramble our command structure. Reordering while trying to fight off being eaten alive just doesn't make a lot of sense to me. The only suggestion I can really say that I agree with is the doctor's suggestion. At least hers can be implemented right now. But what are you yourself suggesting? Mace asked. Echo paused to think. I think we need help. We need to contact the Separatists. We need to work something out. A ceasefire or temporary alliance. Something that will at least stop us from fighting a war on two fronts. But the best case would be if we could combine our forces against them. If it were possible for Echo to have said anything more shocking than what Tarkin had already suggested, he seemed to have just given voice to it. Echo, that's... Anakin started. Look, I know what I look like. I'm basically standing here half-droid myself, Echo shouted. I know that some of you wonder if you can trust me because of all this, he said, gesturing at himself. But please, believe me when I tell you this. I hate droids. I hate being part droid. I've been fighting clankers my entire life, and them stringing me up like a puppet hasn't lessened any of those feelings. But I feel something even more strongly now. Echo reached forward to the base of the holotable's projector, plugging his augmented arm into the interface. I'm afraid, he said, as some of the images he had been forced to see were fed into the display. Scenes depicting otherworldly monsters began to slide by, one after another. Some were among a swarm of their kin, blood-stained talons and claws forming a veritable bestial ocean before their eyes. Others were singular, standing atop hideous altars, viscera and corpses draping them like raiments of rulership. 12 images total. What are we looking at, Echo? Anakin asked, though...
Who they fight. Because the one thing, I had a friend who first thought like 40K, the Imperium were, oh, these guys are bad guys. And yes, the Imperium can be bad guys. But, you know, as they gradually got interested into it, he eventually said to me, well, I mean, why are they so oppressive to their people? I said, well, yes, the Imperium is oppressive, but it is an empire. And then he went on to say, well, are they fighting against somebody for them to have such weaponry? And I'm, because again, they're just slowly introducing someone to 40K and said, yes, there's a reason why they got big guns. Have you ever wondered what they're shooting at? Because it's a crazy world in 40K.
Though he found his eyes couldn't look away. This was part of the information I was able to slip out of Brother Taslian when Tech was breaking me out of the Separatist computers. As far as I can tell, they are image captures from his helmet. They were technically deleted, but the data hadn't been overwritten yet. I've sorted through it and cleaned them up a bit, but what you're seeing, it's what they see. It's what they fight. Echo shook his head, the movement unnervingly despondent. I also got other things. Communication snips, some random statistics on some of the equipment that this man had equipped before. Generals, I'm afraid because none of the data I can understand tells me anything good. And because, while I was grabbing anything I could from the less protected parts of his system, he was doing the same thing to me, but better, more directly. He knows where Coruscant is. He knows what the Republic is. He knows that we are at war. He knows that we are led by the Jedi, that they can use the Force. Yes, Echo, that was in your report, Mace said sternly. Echo nodded stiffly but straightened, not sitting down. Then, respectfully, General, you need to realize that the second their fleet... At that moment, Echo was interrupted again, but not by Mace Windu. The door into the smooth room suddenly swung open, a disheveled Rothonian man entering. Generals! His voice was trembling, the stoic composure of his culture breached by whatever information he needed to relay. The Outsider fleet has just arrived in the Arcanus sector! Everyone jolted at that. How is that possible? I wasn't even aware the Outsiders had left the Axum system, Rex said. It's not that fleet, sir. It's the first fleet. The second fleet... That cannot be possible either. What system? Dr. Sheena almost yelled. The aide stuttered for a moment before managing an answer. It's not an important system. Only a single inhabited planet. Extremely low population index. The tattoo system, I think it was called. But it's sitting at the crossroads of the Trialist trade route and the old Corellian-run hyperspace route. We fear this might signal the beginning of a substantial new blockading effort. Dr. Sheena shook her head, eyes wide in abject denial. They left 4 days ago. There's no way they could have reached this far into the Arcanus sector this quickly. The Rothanian didn't seem to know what to say to her. See, this is what I'm talking about, Echo said, leaning one hand against the table as he gestured with his interface tool towards the aide. We think we know things, but we don't. We're drawing lines, trying to pretend that what we think we know amounts to anything. Maybe hyperdrives are faster, maybe only sometimes. That's why we can't pull punches right now. We need to stop fighting the Separatists. We need to pull everything we have together and then some. The moment their fleet leaves the Axum system, they are going straight to Coruscant, and if they do, we don't know how much time we will actually have. Sirs? The aide interjected again, his pale skin now much, much paler. I was also told to inform you that the Second Fleet has just departed the Axum system. They left the small reserve force around Axum and Anaxis, but most of the fleet departed the system approximately 8 minutes ago. The news was like an ice bath on every ear that heard it. For a brief instant, no more than 1/10 of a second, all were too struck to respond. But this was no longer the first year of the Clone Wars. Prepare a shuttle. We leave in the hour, Mace Windu said. Yes, Master Jedi, said the aide. Contact the Chancellor. Make a formal request to recall the fleets back to Coruscant on my behalf, said Admiral Tarkin. Right away, Admiral, the aide added, coming to the table and withdrawing a datapad from his robe-like garment, beginning to take notes. Also, try to see if you cannot secure a line of communication with the Separatist Council, said Obi-Wan. This had many eyes darting his way, but he raised a hand to assuage them before any words were spoken. Nothing is decided, but we might as well keep our options open, he said. His former Padawan rolled his eyes at that. Right, we might as well call up Death Watch while we're at it, said Anakin, standing and heading for the door. Obi-Wan shook his head, but did not rise to his bait. Rex donned his helmet, and he, as well as the other clones, began to move without being told, with the exception of Bucket, who had to be ordered to follow by the Doctor. But just before they left, the aide asked one more question. Admiral, which fleets? Pardon? Asked Tarkin. Which fleets do you want recalled? From which fronts? Tarkin shook his head. I would have thought that to be obvious. All of them, boy. Request all of them.
He's like, everyone! All right. Well, first and foremost, a very tense briefing between two different sides. The Imperium of Mankind, whom I side with, and the Republic. You know, I have to say this. Making the Imperium the invading threat like the Mongol horde or Attila the Hun, you know, upon the Republic's doorstep, and the whole idea of the Confederacy of Independent Systems being an ally or maybe a ceasefire, unheard of. Now, the Clankers, the droids, really don't have what it takes, and when the Imperium finds out about the other system or the other side having droids as their main military force, with righteous, glorious fury, the Imperium will crush them all, as they should. But I was also made aware that there was a fan-made video report of Admiral Thrawn giving advice to Chancellor Palpatine about the various factions of the Imperium. Now, if you guys and gals want us to check that video out as well, type, and give us your feedback in the comment section below. Your feedback is fundamentally important to our YouTube channel. So, without further ado, since I'm in charge of the ones and twos, I'll see all of you hip cool cats on the flip side. Please take good care of yourselves and each other. Shout out with a fan with too much time. His link to this video is in the description box below. And looking at his channel, hey folks, why haven't you pushed it to 100K? Make it happen. This channel's great, doing a lot of good content, doing a lot of good work. It takes a lot of time, effort, and energy in making these videos, and give him a little boost, as you should, because this is awesome stuff. A fan with too much time. If there's any way one could purchase some artwork, let me know. I might be curious, okay? Just curious minds, inquiring minds want to know. Take good care, and peace.